Hello, my name is Eric Pilcher. I'm a doctoral candidate at the University of Toledo in Ohio. I wanted to talk briefly about Q methodology and complexity in educational research. It's great to be here with those of us who understand the foundational assumptions of Q methodology, namely that the purpose of Q technique is to render the structures and forms of subjective opinions observable. And secondly, that the research goals aren't to standardize or generalize anything. Rather, it's to achieve a representation of a complex phenomenon through experimental design. And that's a refreshing change of pace for those of us who have been sort of face to face with peer review committees or IRB bodies, entities who perhaps rely a little too heavily on the traditional sort of stimulus response relationship. With something in educational research, we know that these uh, uh, approaches to research have roots kind of in behaviorist approaches, Pavlov, for example. Now, even his own contemporary sort of challenged the notion that what happens in a lab should be applied to complex human behavior. Chief among them was Lev Vygotsky, who says, sure, it's easy to do and you can get a lot of easy and clean results. But if you're trying to understand complex reactions, then it's kind of useless. You're only sort of studying the fossils, is sort of how he framed it. Vygotsky got a lot of attention for his notion of cultural mediation, the idea that individuals and culture are entangled, that they mediate each other, that they are transactional, that the individual shapes culture and culture shapes individuality, and the one cannot be understood without the other. And so stimulus response processes are disrupted in Vygotsky's model. There's no longer a direct linear relationship because culture is sort of always getting in the way and mediating. And Vygotsky died at a young age, but his students went on to kind of articulate those elements of culture that influence human activity. And what they ultimately landed upon in the 80s was the cultural historical activity theory, which understood the sort of pieces of an activity system as humans work with the environment towards outcomes. It's this system's view that sort of positions Vygotsky as a kind of a founding father of complex systems theory, in that there's no longer a direct linear relationship between stimuli and responses, but rather that culture is always going to mediate human behavior. So culture, whether it's the material or the psychological elements, key among them is language. And I think this is the first instance where Vygotsky and constructionism and Q methodology really synergizes in this understanding the assumption that language is inherently subjective, which problematizes methods in that understanding that complexity is the norm makes those mechanical assumptions about stimulus and responses sort of irrelevant. And so with those irrelevant linear relationships, we have to start to move away from linear metaphors that we use. And we see this happening in education as we move towards more organic metaphors in the 60s and 70s, which looked to describe human behavior in biological terms. Of course, what we learn is when we look at biology or the natural world, we find infinite complexity. And so, as social scientists sort of worked to translate some of those concepts, Bronfenbrenner was the first to sort of apply an ecological systems theory that looked at the nested but related systems of the natural world and applied them to the sort of nested systems that exist in the social structures of one's culture. The point there is to show that just because linearity breaks down doesn't mean that there is no order. Chaos does not necessarily ensue, but there becomes a really complex and idiosyncratic order that seems to permeate the universe. And so the metaphors that we used to use grow increasingly complex, and Dahl provides us with this fractal notion of a postmodern curriculum that is open and that participants don't actually know where it goes. All of these moves towards postmodernity are represented in the increasingly complex theories that are used to describe them as we move from understanding the world and education not as a system of things, but as a system of systems, and that each of those systemic relationships have their own sort of idiosyncratic qualities. So the complex dynamical systems theories that emerge sort of look at educational processes at all of these nested levels, from the individual micro changes to the individual student as its identity or as an agent, to the sort of a broader chrono or macro systems in place that influence policy. And what they determine is that there are structures and processes inherent in complex dynamical systems, processes of self organization and emergence that ultimately result in attractor and repeller states. So while there's no necessarily symmetry, there is some self-organization that can be understood um, in complex systems. As long as the goal isn't to reduce them to some simple relationships, they can be understood as sort of holistic and complex entities. And in education, they've studied everything from individual schema to historical policy to the complex messiness of praxis in classrooms. Similarly, Q methodologists have been turning more of a critical eye towards educational research, and a recent review of educational research found some 74 studies or more that applied Q methodology across systems of educational policy or educational phenomena. And so we see now opportunities for both Q and complexity to explore and interpret educational phenomena in all of its rich complexity. CDS theory helps us think about systemic behavior in new ways in terms of looking for structures and processes that comprise those interrelationships. And in terms of interpreting, CDS is really desirous of models and visualizations of complex and multidimensional systems. Those are the things that Q does well with its sort of assumption on operant subjectivity as being a complex phenomenon at the heart of all human activity. And then, of course, with the unique and idiosyncratic factor structures that emerge from Q methodological studies. So Q is uniquely equipped to assist complex dynamical researchers who are desirous of methods and tools. As we know, Q can do two things, both provide an alternative to data, but also to help us consider what are the implications in those epistemological underpinnings that break us away from a simple reliance on stimulus response assumptions. I would only add to McCowan and Thomas that for my present study, I'm looking at two distinct and complementary purposes. And this notion of complementarity is pretty important in Q when we think about it as a sort of a complex model for investigating complex phenomena. So Ramlo in 2021 talks specifically about how, because multiple and divergent viewpoints emerge, Q is inherently complementary in the sort of quantum understanding, in that there is no center point, but that each sort of exists in complementary causal relationships with the other. In the macro scale, Q is very complementary because it sort of relies on contrasting theories to explain phenomena. And Ramlo refers to the wave-particle duality, which helps us understand it's not that light is either a wave or a particle, but that it is a both and. And she draws heavily from Bohr to kind of conceptualize these onto-epistemological challenges that Q and complex dynamic systems both really embrace, in that there is this unknowable piece of human phenomena where it's more than one thing at once. And so Q at least embraces that complexity. And I found in another model this kind of quantum metaphor for teaching and learning, that diffraction kind of can serve to help us conceptualize quantum experiences specifically for teaching and learning. Diffraction as a controlling metaphor complexity helps us think about, instead of reflecting what we already have experienced, to diffract those experiences to expose patterns of differences. Like Ramlo says, you can't directly observe quantum phenomenon. And so through diffraction, we can sort of begin to reveal some of the underlying processes that influence a complex phenomenon. So Barad actually gives us the diffractive methodology so we can begin to move our complex conceptualization from reflection toward a diffractive approach to exploring human behavior and interpreting it. I argue in my work that the Q sort activity and Q methodology generally works as a sort of diffractive agent to disrupt an otherwise reflective approach to looking at our experiences in classrooms. And I think Q methodology lends itself to the CDS tradition nicely in that it helps us wonder how Q sort does confront us with oppositional perspectives. And how does that diffract our perceptions? And what kind of diffractions emerge? So Q methodology serves an important tool for complex dynamic systems researchers who maybe need an agile methodology that's flexible enough to adapt to a variety of circumstances at micro or macro levels. And at the same time, complementary, complex dynamic systems theory can give Q researchers and Q methodologists a broader framework that is also agile and that it's flexible and adaptive to a variety of systems or levels of systems to support Q methodological pursuits. At the end of the day, as educational research continues sort of moving towards the reality of a quantum and complex and postmodern ontology, I think both Q methodology and complex dynamic systems studies have a lot to offer for researchers. Those interested in learning more about a complex dynamical systems approach, I would strongly recommend that you check out Kaplan and Garner's 2020 article. If you're a perplexed researcher such as myself, it will speak very clearly to you. That's all I have. I look forward to continuing the conversation in real time with any questions or concerns, and I'll leave you with my references.